Snow didn't fall like gentle feathers. It fell like stones from the sky, cold, heavy, and unrelenting. On the Swan Plateau, the sky had turned ashen since mid-afternoon, and the wind howled as if carrying the moans of forgotten souls. In the midst of that fierce blizzard, a silver-white ambulance quietly rolled across the thick ice, cutting through tall snowbanks and trembling black pine trees. Casey Rhodes gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her brown hair was tied neatly beneath a wool cap, and her gaze was sharp yet clouded, just like the storm outside. At 33, Casey was no stranger to days like this, days when the whole world seemed to shatter into frost and memory. She had been someone else before the fire, before her sister drowned, before life turned to ashes. But today, she was just a weary woman, carrying sorrow beneath a heavy coat and a silence that never left her. Beside her, Jeremy Parrish mumbled into the radio, trying to re-establish contact with a dispatch line that had gone dead from the power outage. The 41-year-old man wasn't fast, wasn't fierce. He was the kind of person who could soothe a feverish child and calm an entire emergency room with just one quiet sentence. His voice was low and steady, like a flame in an old brick stove. And on stormy days like this, Casey thought, that steadiness was the only thing keeping her from slipping into the abyss. No response, Jeremy said, lifting his head from the radio with a slight frown. The call came from near Greystone Hollow. Just coordinates. No voice. No other info. Casey said nothing. Calls like this always unsettled her. They usually led to people who didn't want to be found. Drifters. Those who had given up hope. And sometimes, bodies lying still in the snow. The vehicle turned a bend, headlights slicing through snow thick as milk. And then, they saw it. A dark shape, motionless in the road. Not snow. Not a fallen tree. It was a dog. Jeremy sat up straight. A wolf? No, Casey whispered, eyes locked on the figure. It's a German shepherd. The dog stood tall, its black and gray coat flecked with frost. Ears alert, eyes gleaming. It didn't bark, didn't flinch in the glare of the headlights. It just stared, a look so deep it seemed to pierce through the windshield, through the vehicle, through the frozen shell of Casey's heart. Jeremy rolled the window down and shouted, "Hey, move it, pup, off the road." But the dog didn't budge, didn't blink, didn't tremble. Casey hit the brakes. The vehicle came to a complete stop. In the long silence between wind gusts, she opened the door and stepped out. "Casey, for God's sake, what are you doing?" Jeremy called after her. She didn't answer. The wind sliced her face like knives as she stepped out, slowly walking toward the animal. It didn't run. It simply stepped back once, then paused, its tail lowered. Not in fear, not in panic. Then, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment, it turned and began to walk away. Not hurried, not frightened, but like a silent guide, leading them into the heart of the blizzard. Behind her, Jeremy sighed. "Bet it's just leading us to a frozen rabbit carcass," he muttered, but still got out, flashlight in hand. As for Casey, she said nothing. She knew. There was something in that gaze, something not every wild creature possessed. And as they began to follow that dark figure, Casey couldn't yet know that they weren't just following a dog. They were following fate. The snow reached up to their knees, and each step felt like it was sinking them deeper into another world, one without sound, without color, without direction, only whiteness, trembling trees, and a shadow moving ahead. The shepherd dog that Jeremy now jokingly called, the wolf that knows the way. But Casey didn't laugh, not because she lacked a sense of humor, but because her instincts were screaming in a language only those who have stood at the edge between life and death can truly understand. She walked with firm steps, even as her legs began to numb and the wind whipped across her face like lashes. Every time she paused, the dog would stop ahead, turn its head as if to make sure they were still following. No bark, no wagging tail, just those eyes, deep, waiting, and filled with an unspoken message. Jeremy followed behind, breathing hard but without complaint. He was the kind of man who knew when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. Wrapped in a thick coat, ear-covering hat, and sweeping his flashlight through the forest, Jeremy resembled a slow-burning flame, not blazing, but warm enough to keep the cold at bay. "If you're cold," he said through his scarf, "just remember, At least there's no toxic spill or wildfire out here. Casey slightly curled her lips, the closest thing to a smile she'd managed in months. But she didn't answer, not because there was nothing to say, but because every step was stirring something inside her chest, something she thought she had long buried in ashes. The fire, her sister's death, the cold funeral, and the silence that had lasted 3 winters. She had once been radiant, they used to say that. Before everything was lost. Before she learned how to smile without crinkling the corners of her eyes. Before she understood that some pain doesn't need to be spoken, because it's already in the blood. Jeremy knew. He didn't ask. He didn't prod. He was simply there. Like today. Like now. Walking with her through the storm because of a strange dog and a silent call. His flashlight swept across spindly trees. The dog's paw prints were clear. Steady. Not hurried. Not afraid. Almost as if it had done this before. Casey, Jeremy said softly, do you think this dog isn't just a coincidence? She didn't respond, but that thought had long crept into her mind. No one, no animal, stands still in the middle of a frozen road to block an ambulance. No one stares into another's eyes like that dog had stared at her. And no one leads through a blizzard that way, unless there's a reason. She suddenly remembered something. Its eyes. They weren't wild animal eyes. They were the eyes of something that had lost something once, and was trying to find it again. Jeremy quietly walked beside her. Like a warm shadow. He was always like that. Not loud, not invasive, just present, like a fire in an old hearth. Casey, she carried fire inside. Not the kind that warms. The kind that once burned. The kind that once lost control. And now, it simmered beneath layers of ice, not extinguished. But no longer wanting to burn. Where do you think it's leading us? Jeremy asked. I don't know, she replied, eyes still fixed ahead. But I don't think we can turn back. And then, the dog stopped. Both of them halted. Before them was a strange depression in the snow, the surface unnaturally sunken. As if something lay buried underneath. Rex, the name they would only learn later, stood there. Turned his head, and let out a soft whimper, not of fear, but of pleading. Gentle, purposeful, like a voice from a soul. Casey stepped forward. Jeremy switched on his flashlight, sweeping it quickly over the snow. And then, they saw a scrap of fabric. A metal keychain. A corner of pink cloth. Casey dropped to her knees. And as the snow was brushed away, a tiny hand appeared. Bluish, but still breathing. Oh God, Jeremy choked. Casey said nothing. She only knew one thing. Her heart shattered. In a split second, the howling wind disappeared, the snow faded away, and the collapsing world around them no longer existed. All that remained was Casey, kneeling on the white ground, her trembling hands clawing at the frozen snow like a desperate soul who had just found life beneath a grave. The old military jacket burst open under her hands, its fabric crusted with ice as if it had lain there for hours. And then, she saw that tiny face. A baby girl. Her skin was bluish, lips turning pale green, but her chest, oh God, was still rising and falling. So faint it was almost invisible. But it was there. It was real. It was life. She's breathing, Casey shouted, almost sobbing. Jeremy, she's breathing. The baby is alive. Jeremy had already rushed to her side, opened the medical kit, and flicked on the flashlight. He yanked out the thermal blanket, wrapping the baby as Casey tore off her own coat and added it on top. The wind screamed around them like a beast enraged, as if furious that one soul had refused to be stolen. Careful, Jeremy said, his voice cracking. We had to warm her slowly. Sudden heat could kill her. Casey said nothing, only held the baby girl tightly against her chest, like a part of her own body that had been severed and was now sewn back together. The baby was cold as ice, light as breath, but alive, alive. Behind them, the shepherd, Rex, sat silently beneath a snow-covered tree. 10 paces away. He didn't come closer. He didn't leave. He just watched, like a guardian, like a spirit sent to Earth for the sole purpose of protecting a life too young to know its name. Casey turned back and looked at him, her voice whispering with gratitude. Who are you? There was no answer, no bark, no movement, only those eyes, deep, still, and strangely sacred. They ran back to the ambulance, holding the baby close. Jeremy handled the oxygen bag. Casey cradled the child against her chest, as if afraid that the moment she let go, Ellie, the name they didn't yet know, would slip once again from the grasp of life. As they climbed inside and slammed the door shut, Casey glanced quickly through the front windshield. Rex was gone. No paw prints, no sound, as if he had never existed. But her arms were warming now. And in her hands, the baby girl's lips parted slightly. Breath soft but real, like a miracle. The ambulance shuddered as it started, its tires slipping slightly on the thin sheet of ice as Casey held the tiny, trembling life in her arms. She could no longer feel her fingertips. She didn't care. All that mattered now was the warmth slowly building between her chest and the small body. One heartbeat. One plea. One miracle still breathing. Adjust the temperature, Jeremy said urgently as he hooked up the oxygen tank. No sudden heat. We have to warm her slowly. If not, her heart could stop. Casey nodded, eyes never leaving the tiny face curled within the blankets. She could hear a faint whimper, so soft it sounded like leaves rustling in the wind. A voice calling from the edge of life itself. She pressed her forehead to the child's, whispering as if to her own soul. You're safe now. You're not going anywhere. I swear. She hadn't sworn an oath to anything since the fire. Since she pulled her sister from the flames only to realize the small body had already stopped breathing. But now, in the frozen dead of winter, inside a storm that made no sound, Casey Rhodes made another vow, to a child with no name, no family, and no chance left but them. They reached the clinic in Greystone Hollow just before midnight. Snow covered the vehicle, the windows fogged from the warm breath inside. Casey never let go of Ellie, not even as she stepped through the clinic doors. In her arms, the baby girl was still breathing, faint as the final wind clutching a dying ember. Dr. Ellen Wexley was already waiting, tall and lean, her gray hair tied in a tight bun, her voice deep like a lullaby with no melody. Bring her in, she said briskly, asking no questions. Her eyes paused briefly on the child, then shifted to Casey. 3 children in 2 months. Ellen murmured. And this one, brought in by a ghost. Jeremy set down the oxygen bag. There was no one else. No signs of people. Just a dog. A shepherd. Led us there. Ellen looked up. A dog? Casey nodded. Didn't flinch at the vehicle. Didn't run when we yelled. Just stood there. Then turned and walked off. Like it was waiting for us. The doctor asked no more. She was a woman of action. And when her hands touched the child, now lying in a heated incubator, Casey realized Ellen was fighting alongside them. The baby's temperature was dangerously low. Her breathing irregular, but there were still signs of life. You arrived just in time, Ellen said quietly. 10 minutes later, she wouldn't have made it. When everything settled, Casey stood alone in the hallway. Her gloves were soaked and frozen, her boots covered in snow. But what made her knees weak wasn't the cold, it was the memory of Rex's eyes, silent, calm, as if he had known everything in advance. No one survived a storm like that. No one, except that little girl. No one found her, except a dog. A wordless being. An angel in a coat of frost. She exhaled, not from exhaustion, but because she now understood. From that moment on, the baby girl was no longer a victim. She had a name. It was written in faint ink on the tiny wristband Jeremy had pulled from the snow. Ellie. And when Casey returned to the room and saw Ellie sleeping inside the incubator, her skin now touched by a faint blush of pink, she understood something clearly. The baby hadn't come to be saved. She came to save something in Casey that had died long ago. The next morning, the snow was still falling, but no longer with fury. The wind had softened, as if nature's rage had settled after leaving behind a miracle. Inside the staff room, Casey sat by the window, a cup of cold coffee in her hand, eyes scanning the whiteness outside as though hoping to see a 4-legged figure stepping out from the pine trees. But Rex was gone. No footprints, no sounds, no scrap of cloth, no tuft of fur, not a single clue to prove that he had ever existed in that frozen forest. If not for Ellie, if not for the faint breath inside the incubator, Casey might have started doubting herself. Like a ghost, Jeremy muttered as he brought her another coffee. You sure you didn't imagine that dog? Casey didn't answer. She pulled from her jacket pocket the faded pink newborn bracelet, Ellie's name barely visible in smudged purple ink. It wasn't an illusion, and the way Rex led them, the soft whimper when they hesitated, Those unwavering eyes. No wild animal carries that kind of presence. I saw him, she said firmly. And he saw Ellie. Even before we did. Jeremy sighed. You think he belonged to someone? Casey looked out the window and gently shook her head. I don't know, but he wasn't a stray. Not the way he moved. That evening, after her shift ended, Casey sat in her car, phone on her lap, holding the photo Jeremy had taken before they left the site, a blurry image. Low light, thick snow, but in the bottom left corner, near the tree line, was the faint silhouette of the shepherd. Not sharp, not clear, just a shadow standing there. Enough to convince Casey she wasn't losing her mind. She posted the photo to the town's community forum with a short caption. Found near Greystone Hollow. A German shepherd led us to a newborn buried under the snow. The baby survived. Does anyone recognize this dog? She didn't expect much, but within an hour, her inbox began to buzz non-stop. I saw that dog near the old gas station last week. Could it be the shepherd that showed up near the canyon last winter? My grandma swears there's a ghost dog that's guarded the Monroe Bridge for over 10 years. One message made Casey hold her breath. His name is Rex, not a stray. Former K9 search and rescue. Disappeared after the death of his handler, firefighter Travis Holt, during the Ridge Fire in 2019. No one's seen him since. But he's still out there. Still, on duty. Ivy Lang, former emergency response. Flathead County. Casey's heart pounded. That name, Rex, rang in her mind like a distant bell. Not a stray. Not aimless. A warrior. A soul that never left his mission. She quickly opened Ivy's profile. A woman in her 40s. Silver hair. Wearing a rescue insignia on her shoulder in her profile photo. A forest owl perched on her hand. Her eyes sharp like mountain wind. Casey messaged her instantly. The reply came almost immediately. And then, they talked for 2 hours in the silence of the night. About the fire. About Travis. About Rex, the dog who used to sleep beside infant cribs during rescue drills. About how he would touch his nose to a newborn's hand, so gently it was like he didn't dare breathe. And about the day Travis died, how Rex howled, refusing to let anyone near the body. They had to sedate him to carry him away. 3 days after the funeral, Rex disappeared. No one ever found him again. Until now. When the call ended at 3 a.m., Casey sat motionless in her car. The world was quiet, but her heart was lit with something new. Rex hadn't vanished. He had simply been waiting for a mission worthy of return. And Ellie was that call. Dawn hadn't fully broken when Casey stood on the clinic's porch, her hand tightly gripping a freshly poured cup of hot coffee, but she didn't drink. Her breath drifted like smoke, fading into the still white silence of Red Elk, a small town nestled in the mountains. Blanketed by snow and time, Ellie had passed the critical stage. She slept peacefully in the incubator, breathing steadily, her chest rising and falling like the quiet whispers of a spring still far away. But inside Casey, everything was stirring, like thick ice cracking open to reveal the currents rushing beneath. She knew she couldn't ignore that feeling. The feeling that this wasn't over. Ivy Lang arrived precisely at 7 a.m., tall and thin like an old pine branch. With eyes the color of mountain ash. She didn't say much as she entered, only nodded at Casey as if they had known each other in another life. You met Rex, Casey began. Not everyone gets that honor. Ivy replied softly, hanging her snow-dusted coat on a wooden hook. But if you do, you never forget. They sat at the small kitchen table, where the air still held the scent of cold coffee and untouched granola. The first light of day slipped through the frosted window, illuminating Ivy's weathered hands like flickering firelight. Rex was trained in the Mountain K9 unit. Ivy began, her voice slow and deliberate. Not just scent work, he understood terrain, sound, human condition, and more than anything, he was bonded to Travis Holt like shadow to body. I read his file, Casey whispered. Firefighter. Died rescuing 2 people during the Ridge Fire. Ivy nodded. When the team returned to recover his body, Rex wouldn't let anyone near. He growled, stood guard by Travis all night. After they finally took him away, he went silent, but in his eyes, something had died with Travis. 3 days after the funeral, Rex broke out of his kennel. Disappeared. We searched for weeks. No trail. No bark. Casey swallowed hard. And you think he's still working? It's more than a job. Ivy said. It's memory. Belief. He doesn't understand death. All he knows is that Travis vanished. And he's still waiting. Still saving. Casey closed her eyes, recalling Rex's gaze in the storm, calm, unwavering, fearless. Not the eyes of a surviving animal, but the stare of a warrior who refused to abandon his post. A knock at the door broke the silence. Sheriff Colin Barrett stepped in, his expression graver than the day before. He carried a file envelope and several printed photos from dash cams along Route 8. There's been a fatality confirmed from last night's crash, he said. A woman named Trish Warren. Car lost control, hit the guardrail. She was thrown from the vehicle. No child seat inside. Casey froze. She was Ellie's babysitter. Colin nodded. The baby's mother, Kelsey Monroe, reported her missing 2 days ago. Thought her daughter had been kidnapped. Jeremy entered just in time, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. He caught the end of the conversation and nearly spilled the drinks. Wait, you're saying Ellie wasn't abandoned? He asked. No, Colin replied. The crash sent the car off-road. The child seat was ejected. Tracks from the stroller dragged through the snow, down the slope, then disappeared. Casey whispered. Rex found Ellie, before we did. Pulled her from the crash site. Dug a spot, kept her warm, and then stood in the road, waiting. No one said anything for a long moment. Until Ivy finally spoke, her voice light as forest wind. He doesn't just remember Travis. He remembers purpose. Casey stepped out onto the porch again. The snow had begun to melt into droplets. She looked toward the pine ridge, where the storm once howled. There was no sign of Rex. But in her heart, she could hear the call. Rex was never lost. He was simply finding where he belonged. And this time, Ellie was the answer. That afternoon, the snow began to melt lightly, leaving thin streaks of water on the cabin roofs and trickling down the steps of the clinic. The air was damp and cold, thick with the scent of wet pine. But the sky was no longer its previous dull gray, it carried a faint light. As if even time itself was stepping forward with caution. Casey stood in front of the pickup truck's tailgate, yanking her jacket zipper up tightly. Beside her was Ivy Lang, quietly checking her hiking pack, flashlight, and thermos. After hearing the story of Trish Warren, the crash, the slope, how Ellie had been flung and then disappeared, Ivy hadn't said much. She simply nodded and said, "We need to go back to where Rex led you. Not to find the baby, but to find the reason." Sheriff Colin Barrett joined them too. He walked up in a green parka, pistol holstered at his side, his face still as tense as when he first heard the story. Though still partially skeptical, Colin no longer denied it. Because everything Casey and Jeremy described, the paw prints in deep snow, a child surviving against all logic, had crossed beyond coincidence. They returned to the forest in an off-road vehicle, the tires crawling over slushy, softened snow. They passed narrow roads, nameless curves, and finally stopped at the exact spot Casey remembered, the place where Ellie was found. The shallow dip in the snow was drier now, revealing the distinct impression of a baby carrier once resting there. Casey knelt, gently touching the earth, where something cold had once held the faintest warmth of life. Ivy crouched beside her, eyes quickly scanning the area. "This is the safest spot within half a mile," she said, sheltered from wind. Snow didn't pile heavily, and most notably, no predators came near. "Rex chose this place," Casey whispered. "Not by instinct," Ivy added. "By memory, training, and something harder to name, loyalty to what was lost." Colin checked the terrain, then turned back. "There are footprints. Faint, maybe ours from the other day. But there's another set, smaller. Very faint. Doesn't look recent." Ivy stepped closer, narrowing her eyes. "Not adult prints," she said softly. "They're a child's. Could be Ellie's?" Casey shook her head. "No way. She was strapped in the carrier the whole time." The three of them stood in silence. Then, a voice spoke from behind. "Could be both." A man stepped out from the pine ridge. Tall, lean, but solid. He wore a weathered shearling coat, a hand-knit scarf wrapped around his neck, and both his hair and beard were dusted with snow. "My name's Samuel Wicks," he said, pale blue eyes sweeping over the trio. "I live about 3 miles north. Trap lines, logging. I saw your post, about the shepherd. I think it's been watching me." Colin stepped forward, Watching? Samuel nodded. Not stalking. More like guarding. I'd hear footsteps in the snow. Not a wolf. Not a deer. I'd turn. Nothing. But the next morning, I'd find prints. Big ones. Clear. Leading back toward the edge of the ridge fire zone. Casey tightened her grip. Where Travis Holt died. Samuel looked at her, his gaze softening. Yes. And I think Rex still returns there. The group went quiet. No one spoke it aloud. But they all understood. The place Rex brought Ellie wasn't just a safe zone. It was where his soul had once broken. And now, with Ellie in his care, he was trying to piece it back together. Casey stared at the shallow dip in the snow once more. It wasn't just where a baby had been saved. It was where a dog had placed all his memory, love, and grief into the frozen ground, to protect a spark of life. I need to go back there, Casey said firmly. Ivy looked at her, unsurprised. Because you're not done, are you? Casey drew a deep breath. I haven't even started. That afternoon, the sky over Red Elk turned a quiet shade of lead, not a blizzard. Not sunshine, just a muted glow, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Inside the clinic, Ellie had just woken up. She didn't cry, she simply opened her eyes, blinking slowly, her tiny lips moving as if nibbling on an unfinished dream. Casey stood beside the incubator, eyes fixed on the little girl. For a fleeting moment, she wondered, what if they hadn't stopped the ambulance that day? What if Rex hadn't appeared? What if they'd arrived just 5 minutes too late? Would this fragile life still be here? Before the thought could fade, a knock sounded at the door. Not urgent, not rushed, just gentle, like fate tapping politely. Jeremy entered first, his face visibly tense. Behind him was a young woman. Pale blonde hair hastily tied in a messy bun. Her coat 2 sizes too big. Eyes sunken from sleepless nights. But her gaze, dear God, her gaze was that of a mother who had walked through hell. This is Kelsey Monroe, Jeremy said, his voice hoarse. Ellie's mother. When Kelsey stepped into the room, time nearly stopped. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse in cinematic sobs. She simply stood there, staring at the crib, her eyes locked onto Ellie as if afraid the sight might vanish if she blinked. And then, she crumbled, not just to her knees but entirely. As if every muscle, every tendon in her body gave way after too many days of believing her child was gone. Casey rushed forward, but Kelsey raised a trembling hand, not to stop her, but to reach out and touch Ellie's tiny fingers. Baby girl, she whispered, voice cracked and dry. Ellie, Mommy's here. I'm here, sweetie. She leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. Her lips quivered. The tears didn't pour, they simply spilled. Quietly, mixing with the scent of milk, antiseptic, and the soft, unsteady breath of her child. Casey stepped back in silence. There was nothing she needed to do. Nothing she could say. That moment belonged to no one else. Later, in a small meeting room, Casey sat with Laura Winslow, a social worker newly arrived from Helena. The middle-aged woman wore red-rimmed glasses, her silver hair pinned in a tight bun, her tone firm but not rigid. I've reviewed the records, Laura began. Ellie Monroe, born at Missoula General 7 weeks ago. No father listed. The mother, Kelsey Monroe, reported the baby missing 2 days before the accident. Casey nodded slightly. What really happened? She left Ellie with a close friend, Trish Warren, to work a night shift. Laura continued. Trish left home around 5 p.m., saying she needed to pick up a few things. But on the way back, her car lost control and hit a guardrail. There was no infant car seat in the vehicle. The baby was thrown from the stroller, rolled down the slope, and vanished into the snow. No one found Ellie, except Rex. Casey whispered. Laura looked at her, and no one can explain how that child survived. That evening, as Kelsey stepped out of the clinic with Ellie in her arms, a knitted blanket wrapped around the baby, Rex was waiting by the curb. He didn't approach. He didn't bark. He simply stood there, his coat dusted in snow, his eyes unblinking. Kelsey stopped. Her gaze met Rex's. She said nothing, but her lips trembled as if words were forming inside her. Ellie stirred gently, her tiny hands reaching into the air. And then, Rex stepped forward. One step, then another, and stopped right in front of Kelsey. She bent down, hand extended, and softly touched the dog's head. Thank you, she murmured, barely audible. You knew she was mine, didn't you? Rex didn't nod, but he sat down, silent, eyes lifting toward her as if to say, "I didn't forget." Casey stood in the distance, overcome by a quiet emotion, one that touched a part of her she thought had long turned to ash. The fire from years ago had burned through her trust. But now, something flickered anew, from nothing more than a dog's gaze. A warrior with no name. A sentinel who asked for no praise. An angel, clothed not in wings, but in fur. The next morning, the snow had stopped completely. In its place was a thin veil of mist draping over Red Elk like a light blanket at the tail end of winter. For the first time in days, sunlight streamed through the wooden window of the clinic, casting a gentle glow on the crib where Ellie slept, her skin rosy, her cheeks full, eyelids fluttering with each steady breath. Rex lay right beneath the crib. He didn't move. He didn't sleep. He simply stood guard, as if even angels needed someone to watch over them. Dr. Ellen stepped in, pausing beside the crib, then turned to Casey, who stood nearby clutching a long cold cup of coffee. "She's stable," the doctor said. "No internal trauma. No water in the lungs. No severe hypothermia. Casey, she wasn't supposed to survive. But she did." Casey nodded slightly, her gaze still on Rex. "Because she was chosen," she whispered. After working with Laura Winslow, Kelsey was officially confirmed as Ellie's legal guardian. She hadn't left her daughter's side since. As though every breath was a silent offering to make up for the days of hell they'd both endured. But one thing remained unspoken. Rex still refused to leave Ellie. Not just at the clinic. Even when they moved to temporary lodging, Rex stayed beside the crib. When Ellie slept, Rex curled close. When Ellie cried, Rex was the first to rise. Even when sirens echoed down the streets, Rex would flinch, but never abandon his post. Dale Rankin, a dog behavior specialist from Bozeman, was invited to evaluate Rex. A broad man with tattooed arms but eyes far gentler than expected. Dale spent 2 quiet hours observing the shepherd. Then he sat down beside Casey and Kelsey, watching Rex lie next to Ellie, and said simply, "This isn't just guarding, this is imprinting, deep emotion, a bond forged in loss and redemption. It's like Rex lost a life once, and now Ellie is his second chance to make it right." Kelsey covered her mouth, tears spilling silently. "Can he stay?" she asked softly. Dale met her eyes. "If you're willing, you're not just taking in a dog. You're accepting a soldier who's lost his partner. A soul carrying memory and mission. Rex isn't a pet, he's part of a purpose." Days later, Casey brought Kelsey and Ellie to her home, a small wooden cabin on the edge of town. Nestled between 2 frozen streams and a forest of aging pines. Once her father's, the cabin had been repaired by Casey's own calloused hands and a slowly healing heart. Kelsey stayed in the small guest house out back, modest, but warm, and more importantly, peaceful enough to begin again. Rex remained. No invitation, no leash. He simply chose to stay. As if instinct told him Ellie still needed protecting, even if the danger had passed. Or maybe, Rex still needed Ellie to give him a reason to keep breathing. A week later, Jeremy stopped by, carrying pastries and 2 cups of coffee. He sat with Casey on the wooden steps, watching Kelsey play with Ellie in the yard. Rex rested beneath a pine tree, chin on his front paws, eyes locked on the child. "You think you'll keep him?" Jeremy asked. Casey glanced at Rex, then at Ellie. "I'm not keeping him, Jer," she said with a soft smile. "He's already chosen to stay." Jeremy nodded, setting his cup down beside her. "So, where does family come from? Casey? Blood? Or shared scars?" She didn't answer, but in her heart, she already knew. Family isn't always what we're born into. Sometimes, it's what finds us when we're lost. And this time, it was an old dog who found all 3 of them. On the final afternoon of the month, Red Elk turned cold again. A sharp wind rushed through the pine trees, carrying the scent of sap and the brittle sound of branches clattering like breaking bones. But inside Casey's little cabin, the fireplace crackled bright orange, casting a warm glow across the wooden ceiling and bathing the space in a peace she once believed she'd never feel again. Ellie lay on a handmade quilt, belly up, waving her tiny hands in the air. Her giggles filled the room, shattering any lingering darkness in the hearts of the adults gathered around her. Casey was making tea. Kelsey folded a tiny sweater she'd just bought at the farmer's market. And Rex, always, lay beside Ellie, his head resting gently on the edge of the blanket, eyes half closed, ears always alert. Over a week had passed since their reunion, and Rex had never left. Not out of duty, but by choice. In a world that had long forgotten him, Ellie had become the only place where Rex's loyalty could sink its roots deep. That evening, Casey made a quiet decision to bring Rex back to where it all began, Station 9. The old firehouse where Travis Holt once served, where Rex once waited for commands, standing faithfully by the man he called his partner. The station was no longer fully operational. A few firefighters remained on overnight shifts, some old equipment still in place, and a lingering scent of smoke that had long seeped into the brick walls. When Casey led Rex inside, everyone stopped what they were doing. A tall man with salt and pepper hair stepped forward. His nameplate read, Neil Bram, Captain. He froze when he saw Rex. "Oh my God," he breathed, voice cracking. "Rex?" Rex didn't bark, didn't run forward. He simply lifted his head, looking at the man with the same steady gaze Casey had come to know, searching for something old. Something that still mattered. He used to sit just like that, waiting for Travis to give the word. Neil whispered, never broke formation, never missed a beat. Neil led them to a storage room in the back. He opened a wooden box labeled T. Holt, Ridge Fire. Inside were a few mementos, a scorched helmet, a faded badge, handwritten notes from training, and a photo. Travis and Rex, standing side by side in the golden hour sun. Travis was beaming, arm around Rex's neck. And Rex? That same gaze. Quiet, steadfast, loyal. He was a special rescue dog, Neil said, gripping the frame. Trained for infant recovery. He always reacted first to the sound of a baby crying. Travis used to joke that Rex could tell a baby was about to cry before the mother even knew. Casey lowered her head, gently placing a hand on Rex's head. Now she understood. Rex hadn't just heard Ellie. He had heard his mission. On the drive home, snow began to fall, soft, slow flakes like drifting fragments of memory. Casey drove in silence. In the backseat, Rex rested his head on the window ledge, eyes watching the silent forest beyond. You never forgot, she whispered, not turning around, even when the world thought you were gone. The truck turned onto the narrow trail leading back to the cabin. Yellow light spilled from the window. Inside, Kelsey rocked Ellie to sleep, and the little room glowed with warm fairy lights strung across the ceiling. Rex jumped down before Casey even stopped the engine. He padded straight to the window, peered inside, and let out a breath. A long, deep, quiet exhale, like letting go of something heavy he'd carried through 3 winters. That night, after Ellie had drifted off and the wind had softened to a whisper, Casey opened a drawer and took out something she'd kept, a scrap of Travis's fire-retardant jacket. With a half-sewn firefighter's badge, she walked to where Rex lay beneath the window and gently clipped the badge to his new collar. Rex didn't move. He opened his eyes, looked at her, and closed them again, as if, finally, he had been given permission to rest. And the next morning, for the first time, Rex didn't lie outside Ellie's crib as he always did. He lay inside the room, right next to it, his head resting on the wooden rails. Ellie stirred in her sleep. And Rex? He didn't move. He was no longer just a guardian at the gate. He was now part of a vow that had been fulfilled. Spring didn't come to Red Elk with birdsong or blooming flowers. It came quietly, slowly, like someone with amnesia beginning to remember their own name. The snow didn't melt all at once, but retreated in layers, revealing damp, dark earth and footprints dried into the soil by the wind. But for Casey, spring wasn't in the ground. It was in sound. Specifically, the high, clear laughter of Ellie echoing one early morning through the open door. Drifting into the kitchen as she stacked firewood. Not loud, not sharp, but enough to awaken something in her heart, something no longer shaped like ashes. Outside, Ellie, now nearly 3 months old, lay on a woolen blanket in a patch of just-returned grass. Kelsey sat beside her, occasionally leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. And Rex, as always, lay at the edge of the blanket, guarding with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. No one had trained Rex to do this. He simply knew Ellie was his. Not in the sense of possession, but in the deepest, most sacred sense. I was chosen to never leave her. Kelsey had officially moved to Red Elk. She rented the small house behind the cabin, once used by Casey's father. She painted the window frames, planted daisies along the porch, and hung old photographs of her mother in the corner. Inside, the bookshelves slowly filled with children's books gathered from flea markets, each one cleaned, pressed flat, as if every page was a piece of memory brought back to life. She'd gotten a job at the town library. The pay was modest, but steady, enough to live, and more importantly, enough to begin again. That Sunday afternoon, Casey sat with Jeremy on the porch, warm tea in hand, the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance like a horn gently bidding winter farewell. Jeremy glanced at the yard. "Kelsey's doing better," he said, sipping. "How about you?" Casey pressed her lips together, then exhaled slowly. "I didn't think I'd ever feel peace again." "And now?" She looked at Rex lying beside Ellie, ears twitching every time the baby made a sound. "Now," she said, "I think peace isn't something we find in a place. It's something we choose to allow." Jeremy nodded. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. That night, as Casey was about to lock up, she saw Kelsey standing in the shadows near the path, Ellie in her arms, Rex at her feet. "I've been meaning to say this for days," Kelsey began, voice low like she feared waking the night itself. I'd like to ask if I can keep Rex. Let him stay with us. I know you love him. I don't want to assume." Casey stepped forward, placed a hand gently on Kelsey's shoulder. "You don't need to ask," she said. "Rex chose you, chose Ellie. I was just lucky enough to witness it." Kelsey laughed through tears. "You really believe that?" Casey nodded. "I don't believe in luck, but I believe in will. And Rex has the strongest will of any soul I've ever met." The next day, Ivy Lang returned to Red Elk with a new collar in her hand. Etched on its surface were the words, "Rex, guardian of Ellie." Not lost, just waiting. The whole town knew the story by then. But no one made noise. No ceremony. No reporters. No headlines. Just a quiet gathering at the edge of the woods. Near the park, people brought wildflowers. An elderly woman sang a soft Appalachian folk song. A little boy laid a worn teddy bear at Rex's feet. And Casey, standing at the edge, held Jeremy's hand tightly as she listened to her heartbeat in rhythms no longer out of place. A new wooden sign had been mounted beneath the largest pine tree. Its surface bore a single, simple engraving, "For the one who remembered." That night, as Casey passed by Ellie's room, she stopped at the door. Ellie was sleeping, and Rex lay right beneath the crib, his head resting on the wooden rail. Eyes closed, breath even, no tension, no guarding, no longer the sentinel of someone else's dream. For the first time since the fire 3 years ago, Rex was truly asleep, and unafraid to dream. April came to Red Elk like the warmth of a hand resting on a heart that had long gone cold. Not loud, not sudden, just gentle, and impossible to resist. Ice cracked on the creek in delicate lines. Old maple trees began to bud, and the scent of pine after rain whispered something only those who had once lost could truly understand. In Casey's old wooden cabin, life continued, without drama, without crescendo. Each day passed like a quiet measure in a symphony of healing. And at the center of that music was Rex. He was still there, needing no command, no reminder, still sleeping beneath the crib each night, still walking beside Ellie each morning, still lifting his head at the sound of a distant siren. But now, no more flinching, no more fear, just learning to breathe again. One morning, Ellie, now strong enough to roll over, reached out from her blanket and touched Rex's ear. He didn't move, just opened his eyes, and looked at her. Two gazes, one innocent, one weathered, met in the golden light of spring. Kelsey laughed from the kitchen. "He loves her more than he loves us," she joked. Casey, wiping down the table, looked up. "He doesn't love her," she said softly. "He understands her." That evening, Ivy Lang visited for the last time before returning to the wildlife center. She brought a small pouch, in it, a worn metal tag once attached to Rex's working collar. This was all that survived Ridge Fire, Ivy said, placing it in Casey's hand. Travis kept it, said, "It's not department issued, it's family." Casey fastened the tag onto Rex's new collar. He didn't react, just took a breath, as if a missing part of himself had returned to where it belonged. A week later, Casey brought Ellie to the library where Kelsey worked. And something unexpected happened. For the first time, Ellie laughed out loud when she saw her mother wave. Not just a giggle, but a reach, arms outstretched, and a bubbling sound from her mouth. Kelsey burst into tears right there in the foyer. And Rex? He simply lay at Casey's feet, eyes following mother and child. But if you looked closely, you'd see that old tail just barely wag. Once, then still. By late spring, Casey took Rex back to the fire station. Not for closure, not for nostalgia, but because she felt she owed him something. She led him into the archives, took out the photo of Travis, the firefighter who had walked through so many flames with Rex by his side. Rex looked at the picture. Didn't bark, didn't move forward, just sat, and slowly lowered his head, until it touched the corner of the frame. Casey said nothing, just sat beside him in silence. You found your purpose again, didn't you? She whispered. No answer. But in the hush of that room, in the light spilling through dusty windows, in the long exhale Rex gave, something said, yes. A week later, Casey stood on the porch, watching the yard where Ellie sat propped up on a blanket, Kelsey reading nearby, and Rex stretched out in the shade, eyes closed, ears still attuned to every small sound. Jeremy stepped onto the porch, holding a mug of tea. He's older now, he said, looking at Rex. Casey nodded. Older, but lighter. Jeremy smiled, because he finally brought one child home. Casey turned, eyes shimmering. Not just one. That night, rain fell soft across the mountains. Not cold, not stormy, just like a hand stroking the shoulders of the forest. Casey stood by the window, watching Rex curled beneath Ellie's crib, his head resting on the wooden rail. He slept soundly. No tensing, no startles, sleeping, perhaps for the first time in his life, without guarding someone else's dream. Above him, Ellie smiled in her sleep, tiny hands stretching open as if to embrace the whole world. Her world, a mother who had walked through despair, a woman who had risen from the ashes, and a dog who had remembered why he was born. If you're still here, perhaps your heart is as still as ours was when we finished telling this story. The story of Ellie, a newborn buried beneath the snow, and Rex, a dog who refused to let grief define the rest of his life. Rex didn't need medals. He didn't need a stage. He only needed a whisper from somewhere deep within his soul. No one else gets left behind. So he waited, through winter, through 3 years of no one calling his name, just to one day, led 2 lost souls, to a child still breathing, not out of instinct, but out of heart. We often think angels must have wings. But maybe, some walk on 4 legs, coated in snow, and never turn away when a baby cries. If this story touched you, please share it. Because somewhere out there, there are still Rexes, waiting for someone to believe. And maybe, you will be the one they choose. Don't forget to leave a comment. Let us know, where are you watching from? Have you ever met a Rex in your life? And if you believe love never dies, type, I believe, in the comments. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story, where hope is written in 4 paws, and a tail that never stops standing guard.